Fighting men became heroes. Magic users became sorcerers. But these weren't just fancy names, they told you who your character was becoming. What if level titles were more than just flavor text? What if they were the key to how D&D was designed? Let's unpack it all today on Daddy Rolled a One. Hello there, and welcome back. I'm Martin, and this is another video in my series on the history of early tabletop role-playing games, including Dungeons & Dragons. Today we're going to be talking about sort of an often forgotten or misremembered part of the early editions of Dungeons & Dragons published by TSR. And some might even call them a relic of older editions. And this is not something that is a difference between, like, say, TSR editions and Wizards of the Coast editions. This is something that naturally evolved over the course of time at TSR and then eventually fell out of flavor almost a full decade before Wizards of the Coast took over TSR. And that is the subject of level titles. So in today's video, what I'm going to be talking about are just the idea of what these level titles are, which editions they appeared in at TSR. And then I'm going to get into a little bit of theory on why level titles existed, sort of where they come from, why they were included in the game. And I'm going to come up with sort of what I think is sort of a unique approach to looking at what a level title was actually supposed to represent and how it might have been used by some of the earlier creators, specifically Gary Gygax. And then at the end of the video, I'm going to share some thoughts on how you can use level titles in a current or modern game. It doesn't really matter what edition of D&D that you're using, and some other games that are adjacent to D&D that use level titles in kind of a new and different way. So that's what's coming up. I just kind of wanted to outline what you can expect in the video. And I would like to ask that if this kind of content, where these deep dives into a specific subject, is something that is of interest to you, then please take a few seconds to like the video, make sure that you're subscribed to my channel, and please hit the bell icon and adjust your notification settings so you'll know when I upload a new video just like this one. And lastly, if you could please share the video with your friends, colleagues, other YouTubers, people that you don't think are aware of my channel. All that stuff really helps the algorithm to know that people are interested in this content. Okay, so let's dive in and start talking about this idea of level titles. Now, when I originally started thinking about this video, I was thinking that it might not be enough content to create a full-length video, and I was trying to figure out, like, should I do a mishmash where I just like a collection of a bunch of different shorter topics? But as I delved into it, I realized that there was actually a lot more meat to this than I was originally thinking, and I thought it would be interesting to look at it as a full-length video. So if you are new to role-playing games, and new meaning at this point, if you started with any edition of Dungeons & Dragons, starting with the second edition of Advanced D&D or forward, then you might not even know what a level title is and what I'm talking about. So let's get into that and look at it. So this is original D&D from 1974, which is where level titles are first going to debut. So this is Men in Magic, the first booklet of 3 booklets. It's volume 1 here. And this is going to explain our character types. And in here we have the 3 character types. No, that's not a mistake. There were only 3 classes in original D&D. Fighting Man, which later is going to be called Fighters, Magic Users, and Clerics. And as you see here, for Fighting Man, they don't tell you a level like first, second, third. Instead, they have a name. So we see here the titles of Veteran Warrior, Swordsman, Hero, Swashbuckler, Myrmidon, Champion, Superhero, and Lord. And then you see for Magic Users similar: Medium, Seer, Conjurer, Theurgist, Thaumaturgist, Magician, Enchanter, Warlock, Sorcerer, Necromancer, and Wizard. And then lastly, for Clerics, we have Acolyte, Adept, Village Priest, Vicar, Curate, Bishop, Lama, and Patriarch. So a few things of interest here. First, each class has a different sort of cap level where they sort of just stop. So Fighter is at level 9 with Lord. Magic User is at level 11 with Wizard. And then Cleric is at level 8 with Patriarch. But that's where we're going to see this. Now, it doesn't use the word level title. it just says levels and number of experience points necessary to attain them. And so in this case, it's using the title in place of a number, in place of like the numerical representation of the level. So the term level title wasn't used here. Okay, so now at the end of this section, I'm going to go through each one of these and talk about which editions included these. And then at the end of this, before we get into sort of where they came from and why these level titles were included in the game, I am going to do some comparison charts, and we're going to look at each class sort of like side by side and see how the level titles are similar or different across these different editions. But that's original D&D from 1974. And now, just really quickly, we have the supplements where the new classes are introduced. Okay, so in here, this is Greyhawk Supplement 1. This is 1975. And in here, we're going to get both the Thief class and the Paladin subclass. However, the Paladin is explained in such a way that it basically just says if you've been playing as a fighter and you had a certain charisma score and you'd been lawful since first level, you could become a Paladin. And it doesn't give level titles for that. It just tells you that you can be a Paladin if you choose to be so. Now, here's our Thief table, and it says level and number of experience points necessary to attain. So again, we're not using numbers here. We're just using names. So the Thief titles are Apprentice, Footpad Robber, Burglar, Cutpurse, Sharper, Pilferer, Master Pilferer, Thief, and Master Thief. So that's it for Greyhawk. And then in Blackmoor, we get two new classes in here as well. The Monk and the Assassin. So here's our table. So the Monk level titles are Novice, Initiate, Disciple, Immaculate, Master, Grandmaster, and then Grandmaster of Dragons, Grandmaster of the North Wind, Grandmaster of the West Wind, Grandmaster of the South Wind, Grandmaster of the East Wind, Grandmaster of Winter, Grandmaster of Autumn, Grandmaster of Summer, Grandmaster of Spring, and Grandmaster of Flowers. And then for Assassins, our titles are Apprentice, Killer, Murderer, Slayer, Cutthroat, Dacoit, Thug, Executioner, Assassin, Senior Assassin, Expert Assassin, Chief Assassin, Prime Assassin, and Guildmaster of Assassins. So already we're seeing here some, not much, but a little bit of repetition, because our Thief titles, we see that a first level Thief is called an Apprentice, and then a first level Assassin is also called an Apprentice. So a little bit of repetition there. And you have some unique words here. So dacoit and thug both come from the subcontinent of India and their culture there. Okay, so that's the Thief and, the Assassin and the Monk. Now, next up, we're going to get the Druid, which is going to debut as a character class in Supplement 3, Eldritch Wizardry. This is 1976. And here we have our level titles: Aspirant, and then Initiate of the First Circle, and then that's going to go first, second, third, fourth, fifth, sixth, seventh, eighth, ninth circle, and then Druid, Archdruid, and the Great Druid. So those are our level titles for those classes in original Dungeons and Dragons. Okay, now what's going to happen in 1977 is, again, we're going to get this basic box set here of basic Dungeons and Dragons. This is the one that's edited by Eric J. Holmes, and here we have our rule book. Now, this only covers levels 1 through 3, but it's an important step in the history of Dungeons and Dragons. And so let's look at what we have here. And we do have level titles, although here, again, it doesn't say title, it just says level. So the chart says level, experience points, hit dice, and spells, and then level, and then it sits in a column over here. It says 1, 2, 3, and again, only goes through the first 3 levels. And then the level is in parentheses, and so fighters are veteran warriors, swordsmen. That's a repeat from what we saw in original D&D. Magic users are medium, seer, conjurer. Clerics are acolyte, adept, and priest. So there's a little bit of difference there, because in original D&D, the third level was called a village priest. And then thieves are apprentice, footpad, and robber. So these are very, very close. The only really tweak here is that village priest versus priest. But those are our level titles for this edition of Dungeons and Dragons in 1977. Now, Again, if you're new to the channel or you're new to studying the history of Dungeons and Dragons and you're not aware of all these different editions, there's two things that you can do. Definitely, you would want to check out my video on the history of D&D editions. It's one of my earliest videos, and in about roughly 20 minutes, I go through like 18 different editions of D&D and explain why I call them different editions. So you can check that one out. And then the other thing that you can do is I have a newish playlist that I'm calling the Differences of D&D Editions that goes through, again, edition by edition and talks about what's different of that edition versus what had come before. And I start pulling out like mechanics and things like that. It's mostly mechanically driven. Like, what are the differences in these things that get us to the way that the game has evolved over time into where you get to like 5th edition and the 2024 edition. So you can check out that playlist for extras. The other thing that I wanted to mention is for all these different character classes like thief, assassin, monk, druid, I have videos about all of those classes and where they come from and how they've evolved over time. So you can check out my class history playlist to learn more about those. Okay, but that's 1977. Now in 1978, we are going to see the release of the Player's Handbook for Advanced D&D, the hardback book. So this is now a different game. It's a separate game from either original D&D or the Holmes version of D&D. But in here, we are going to have, for the first time, the use of the term level title. So it does give you experience points, experience level. So you have the 1, 2, 3, 4, etc. And then you have the number of hit dice for accumulated hit points, and then the level title. And so you see each of the classes in here: cleric, druid, fighters, paladins. It's that cartoon. If you guys have seen me talk about this before, my mom stuck this in here for me years ago before she passed away, obviously. Rangers, you have magic users, you have illusionists, you have thieves, you have assassins, and then at the very end here, you have monks. Okay, and then way in the back of this book, in the appendix, is where we're going to find the Bard class. This is a special thing. Watch my video on Bards to understand why this is in the appendix. But they do have level titles, as you see here. Now, what's interesting is when you read through the book here, and it's talking about the setup of character classes in AD&D, it talks about description, functions, and levels. It never defines what the level title is. It never tells you. Notes regarding character classes. And it says like class of characters, self-explanatory. Hit die type shows the type of die to be rolled by the character for the appropriate class at each level of experience, blah, blah, blah. And this is maximum number of hit dice, spell ability, and class level limit. So it defines all of those. It never defines what this level title is or what you're supposed to do with that. And as you saw, it doesn't even describe it here. And now this version of D&D, the Holmes edition, was intended to kind of organize and more clearly explain the rules for Dungeons and Dragons. It never defines what these level titles are, or again, what you're supposed to do with them, ever. So it has all these character classes. It tells you what they are, and it gets into non-player characters. I mean, it never gets into what you're supposed to do with these terms over here. And of course, in original D&D, it was not defined at all. In the index, the Dungeon Master's Guide index for advanced D&D, there's not even an entry for the term level, let alone level title. Like, it's not in there. So it's never being explained what you're supposed to do with this. Okay, so that's the Advanced D&D Player's Handbook. Now, in 1981, we're going to have the release of the the Molde Basic set, and then the Cook Marsh Expert set, so collectively called the Molde Cook Marsh edition of D&D, or more commonly known as BX D&D. This is the basic rulebook, which covers levels 1 through 3. We're going to look at the expert rulebook because this has all of the titles up through level 14. So we're going to see here the cleric titles again. Now, what's interesting here, and we've talked about this before, but in this version of Dungeons & Dragons, dwarf, elf, and halfling are classes. There's not races. There's not a separation of race and class. If you want to play a dwarf in this version of the game, you play a dwarf, and that's it. There's no adjustment to your character, and the dwarf has abilities that are different from other characters. It's essentially a fighter with extra goodies. Similarly with halflings. Halflings are like fighters with some extra goodies. Elves are basically a combination of fighter magic user, and you can see that here by their level titles, because the elf level titles are simply just mixing the magic user and fighter titles with a slash in between. So first level elf is a medium veteran, and a second level elf is a seer warrior. Now, the dwarf and halfling titles, all they do is say dwarven and then put that before the fighter level title. So dwarven veteran, dwarven warrior, dwarven swordman. I think that was a missed opportunity rather than coming up with some unique titles to just repeat it. And then if you see here with the halflings, it's the same thing. The only one that's different for halfling is level 8, which is sheriff. Instead of being a level 8 superhero. So instead of halfling superhero, the level 8 halfling is called a sheriff, and that is the maximum level that you can be as a halfling in this game. Okay, but then here you see, the magic user titles and the thief titles. Okay, so again, I'm going to be doing some comparisons on these, but I just wanted to show you those different titles right now. And for those of you who are listening, I will try to read out the titles when I can, but I'm not going to go line by line for every edition. That would just take forever. Okay, now 1985. So this was 1981, this version of the game, the Moldvay Cookmarsh Basic set. In 1983, there's going to be another version of the basic line that comes out. This one is edited by Frank Mentzer. It is commonly known as the Beckme edition of Dungeons and Dragons. So Basic Expert Companion Masters and Immortals. That's Beckme. And in that edition, they do have level titles that are listed in both the basic and expert books of that series, but they match pretty much exactly what you see in Moldvay. Now, the one difference that's going to be a change, and we can go over this. We'll just go over it now. That difference is going to be with the magic user level tiles, because if you see here, level 3, they spell conjure CONJUROR. That's not how it's spelled. It should be ER at the end. And then they spell sorcerer, SORCEROR. I grew up thinking that that's how you spelled those two words, because this is how I first saw them. And in addition, Gary Gygax had a column in Dragon Magazine called From the Sorcerer's Scroll. And they kept flip-flopping over the years how they spelled sorcerer. Sometimes it was spelled ER and sometimes it was spelled OR, both in the table of contents as well as the logo made for the column went back and forth, whether they used ER or OR. So sorcerer both of those are misspellings. That's not how you spell it. So the Mentzer edition is going to use the exact same titles that are listed here, but they're going to do the correct spelling for conjurer and sorcerer. But other than that, they're exactly the same. So I'm not going to really go over the Mentzer version of D&D titles, because other than that spelling correction, there's no difference. Now, in 1985, you have the release of Unearthed Arcana. Now, this one's interesting. We do have 3 new classes that come out in this version of the game. Now, these 3 classes are going to be the Cavalier, which was originally presented as a subclass of fighter in Dragon Magazine number 72, but it is going to become its own core class in this game. And then the Paladin, which had previously been a subclass of fighter in Advanced D&D in this book here, the Paladin's going to be moved to be a subclass of Cavalier. Now, if you're new to D&D, and again, you started with 5th edition, the use of the term subclass in this edition of D&D, the 1st edition, is very, very different from the use of the term subclass in 5th edition. So it basically just meant that there were 4 sort of core classes, which was fighter, cleric, magic user, and thief. And every other class, whether it was druid, assassin, illusionist or ranger, paladin, any of that kind of stuff fit under one of those core classes. And that way you knew that they used the same hit die tables, usually the same saving throw tables, the same attack matrices, all that kind of stuff. They sort of grouped them together in those sort of classes. The one that stood alone was the monk, which was its own separate individual class. And now in this book, 1985, they're going to make the Cavalier a 6th core class. Okay, then the other 2 classes that are in here are the Barbarian, which is a subclass of fighter, and the Thief Acrobat, which is technically not a full class. It is a split class, and that debuted in Dragon Magazine number 69. The Barbarian debuted in Dragon Magazine number 63. But let's look at the Cavalier. And we see here some level titles. Now, this is interesting because we have, for the first time, 0 levels of experience for Cavaliers. This is based on the social class of the character. If your social class wasn't high enough, but you wanted to be a Cavalier, you had to start out at 0 level and negative experience points and play through those 2 negative experience point levels until you had enough XP to become a first level character. So that's all that is. But those are your level titles for the Cavalier. Now, I'm going to skip to Thief Acrobat really quick, and we'll come back to the Barbarian, and it'll make sense why I'm doing that. But here's our level titles for the Thief Acrobat. And they start at experience level 6. So the Thief Acrobat being a split class means you start as a thief for levels 1 through 5. And then at level 6, if you have a high enough ability scores in certain areas, you can decide to become a Thief Acrobat rather than maintaining your status as just a thief. And now you are a split class. And so you're going to learn some extra skills. And so your level titles are, and they're different titles. The, Burglar Acrobat for level 6, but then it's 7th level, second story thief, then Cat Burglar, level 8, Master Cat Burglar, Thief Acrobat, Master Thief Acrobat, and then at level 12, Master Thief Acrobat, parentheses 12th. Okay, now let's go back and look at the Barbarian and the level titles. Level title for level 1 through level 11, your level title is Barbarian. So, I think it's funny. And as a kid, it annoyed me because I liked using level titles to kind of help develop the culture of the world. And by using just the same title for the Barbarian, first I thought, why even bother putting it on there if it's just going to repeat Barbarian all the way down for 11 different levels? But then I was reading James Malachewski's blog, and again, forgive me if I'm pronouncing James's last name incorrectly, just based on what I've learned about Eastern European culture and those types of names. I believe it's pronounced Malachewski, but it very well could be Malazewski. I don't know. But he wrote a blog post or a series where he talked about level titles, and one of the things that he said about this, and I thought it was very intriguing, was the idea that with the Barbarian having these different titles, it kind of implies that there are different people in the campaign world, different organizations or whatever it was, that decide what these titles are and that bestow them upon people. And it makes more sense with things like, I'd say, the assassin and the druid and the monk, because those are very organizationally written character classes where it talks about advancing up through the hierarchy of those organizations. But you could apply it to the other character classes as well. It's just they're a little bit more generic. But the idea is that with the Barbarian, because they are outside of the quote unquote standard culture or like the mainstream culture, Barbarians are outsiders by design. They're not part of the rest of the the world usually, and that's what sets them apart and helps make them different. And so the fact that they don't fit in with that culture means that the people who name these things didn't know what to do with them. And so they just said they're barbarians because they don't know how to describe the hierarchy of this society that they don't know anything about. And I thought that was a really unique and special way of kind of looking at it. And that's a little tip for people thinking about using level titles. And, again, we'll get to more of those at the end of the video. But I thought that was a really interesting way of looking at this. Okay, now, 1985. This is released in summer of 1985. I forget what month. I want to say June. I definitely remember getting it in the summer. While I was on summer vacation with my family. We were, I think, in Denver at the time, and I picked it up at a game store there. My mom said I could buy one thing, and I was deciding between this and the companion set for the basic line of D&D, and I picked this. And then this book is going to be released in the fall of 1985, Oriental Adventures. So these were two big hardback books released in 1985, coming off a year from 1984 where there were no hardback releases for advanced D&D. So Oriental Adventures is going to introduce a bunch of new character classes for advanced D&D. Now, I have to be careful with my book. As I've talked about before, I have a whole video where I just talk about this book, but it is my only book, hardback book for advanced D&D, where the binding is separating from the cover. And it's very, very frustrating, but is a very common complaint about this book specifically, but also this kind of era of printing. A lot of people have problems with their Unearthed Arcana book. My Unearthed Arcana book is fine. And it's not because I read it any less than this one. I don't know why, but this one is kind of starting to separate. But my point here is that if you look here, we have the introduction of barbarians. Now, this is a version of the Barbarian from Unearthed Arcana, but it is adapted to a Eastern Europe or Eastern setting. An Asian setting, faux Asian, and but there's no level titles. You'll see they don't even put like the barbarian. That's just nothing here. And as we go through and we look, here's Bushi, which is a fighter subclass. There are no level titles. So this book introduces a bunch of new classes, and there are no level titles except for Monk. And the Monk has level titles because they just repeat the ones from the player's handbook. So the Monk class here is essentially the one from the player's handbook. I think there's a few tweaks, but every other class that's introduced in here does not have level titles. So you're already starting to see 1985. This is just barely a decade after D&D has debuted. The shift where people are thinking like, we're not going to use these level titles. Okay, now 1987. You're going to have the release of the Dragonlance Adventures book for Advanced Dungeons and Dragons. And in this book, we also get new character classes that debut, but these classes have titles. So going against the grain of what we saw in Oriental Adventures 2 years earlier, these classes have titles. So you have the Sword Knight, Knights of the Sword, and you see their titles here: Novice of Swords, Knight of Swords, Blade Knight, Knight Clerist, Abbot of Swords, etc. There's basically 3 different knightly orders. You have the Knights of the Rose, and they have their own titles. And what I thought was really cool and interesting is that they could have been really repetitive and use this like novice, knight, blade, knight, blah, 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 and like repeated that for each one of these, but they didn't. Each one has unique. I mean, there's a little bit of repetition, but not a lot. So Knights of the Rose titles: Novice of Roses, Knight of Tears, Knight of Mind, Knight of Heart, Knight of Roses, Keeper of Roses, Master of Roses, Arch Knight, Lord of Roses, Master of Justice. Like you have those. And then you're going to have, I guess I skipped over Knights of the Crown. That must have come first. Yep, here we go. So here's the Knights of the Crown. And you have your titles as Squire of Crown, Defender of Crown, Knight of Crown, Scepter Knight, Shield of Crown, Lord of Shield, Lord of Crown, Master Warrior, Lord Warrior, High Warrior. Okay, and then you also have the debut of Tinker Gnomes, and there's a Tinker class that's only takeable by Tinker Gnomes, but their level titles are Aid 5th, and then it goes 4th, 3rd, 2nd, 1st, and then you have Mate 2nd, Mate 1st, Tinker, Master Tinker, Craft Gnome, Craft Master, and Head Tinker. And then all the way down here, now there skips a few levels, and then you get Master Craft Gnome. So Dragonlance Adventures 1987 does stick with the level titles. Now, to my knowledge and understanding of the different products that came out, as far as official D&D classes or advanced D&D classes, I'm not talking about stuff from Dragon Magazine that was unofficial. The only official classes in Dragon Magazine were those that were written by Gary Gygax. So other than those, as far as I know, this is the last time that we're going to see official level titles used when debuting a new class for, again, either Dungeons & Dragons or Advanced Dungeons & Dragons. So in 1989, you're going to have the release of the 2nd edition Player's Handbook for Advanced Dungeons & Dragons. And for the first time in here, we're going to see the presentation of classes with no level titles at all. So they start with Warrior, and there's, Fighter, Paladin, Ranger, and you see the different hit dice and the different experience points there, but there are no level titles. And that's going to be throughout this book. They don't use level titles. And this is the point where D&D stops using level titles, 1989. So you're going to have the release in 1991 of the Rules Cyclopedia, which is a collection of the basic, expert, companion, and master's rules from the Beckman edition. So it leaves out the Immortals rules, puts all those rules, condenses them into one rule book, and presents them. But in that book, they eliminate the level titles that had been used in the basic and expert box sets from that edition. So they just take them out completely. That's one of the big changes. It's not a giant change, obviously, because it doesn't really affect the gameplay, but it removes the level titles, even though they had used them in that edition. And then from that point, on, there are no more. And then, obviously in the Wizards of the Coast era with 3rd, 3.5, 4th, 5th, in the 2024 edition, there have not been level titles. Okay. Now let's look at some comparisons of titles by class and see what some of these differences are. Okay, so I'm going to put some graphs here up on the screen so you can see what we're talking about. And what I'm going to compare is original D&D to Holmes to AD&D and then to Moldvay. I'm calling it, Moldvay, or it's the BX edition, right? So, and look at where the level titles are different. And where we're going to start is with Fighting Man or Fighters. So that was called Fighting Man in original D&D and in Holmes D&D. Holmes Basic, and then starting with AD&D onward in 1978, they're going to call them Fighters. Okay, so the level titles here are pretty darn close. So you have Veteran across the board is used as a first level fighter, and then Warrior and is used again, and then you have Swordsman used in original D&D and Holmes, and then in AD&D you also have Swordsman, but in Moldvay or BX it's called a Sword Master. So the BX edition, specifically 1981, starts to be a little bit more. They come up with like alternative titles that are either more gender neutral, or they'll do things like say, Lord/Lady, things like that, as opposed to just using the masculine term. But otherwise, they're very, very close. So the fighter terms here are very, very similar across the board. So again, the one difference that you're going to get is in the BX edition at level 9, instead of just Lord, it's Lord, and then in parentheses it says Lady. Okay, so that's the Fighting Man. So let's go on to Magic User and see what we have here. Now, this one's going to be very, very different, especially at the advanced D&D level. So original D&D, we have Medium, Seer, Conjurer, Thurgist, Thaumaturgist, Magician, Enchanter, Warlock, Sorcerer, Necromancer, and Wizard. And Holmes D&D is going to repeat those first 3, Medium, Seer, and Conjurer. Okay. And then, of course, that edition stops at that level. So we don't have any extra levels for Holmes. Now, the BX edition is going to repeat those, Medium, Seer, Conjure. And then at level 4, though, it's going to switch from Thurgist to Magician. And then it's going to have Enchanter at level 5, Warlock at level 6, Sorcerer at level 7, Necromancer at level 8, and Wizard at level 9. Now, one of the things about the BX edition of D&D, Moldvay Cook March edition, is that level 9 is across the board what is known as the name level. The only one that's different is Halflings, because Halflings top out at level 8, so their name level is at level 8, which is Sheriff. We talked about that a second ago. So across the board, the highest name level that you're going to get in Moldvay Cook March edition is at 9, and then past that at 10th, 11th, everything, you're still just that title with your level tacked onto it. So at 10th level, a Moldvay wizard is just a 10th level wizard, which is, that ruins the immersion of the title because you're putting 10th level in front of it. Okay. Now, AD&D is going to be very different. At first level, they're going to change. It's not going to be a medium. You're going to be a prestidigitator. And then level 2, you're going to be an evoker, not a seer. Then they do use conjure at level 3. And then they use Thurgist, so they're going back to the Thurgist at level 4, Thaumaturgist, Magician. At that point, they pretty much line up with what you had in original D&D. So it's those first 2 levels that are very, very different name-wise. Okay, so in original D&D and AD&D, the quote-unquote name level for a magic user comes at level 11, which is Wizard. Okay. Now, let's look at Cleric, the last of the first original 3 classes. So in original D&D, the levels stop at 8. So you have Acolyte, Adept, Village Priest, Vicar, Curate, Bishop, Lama, and Patriarch. And then Acolyte, Adept, and Priest are repeated in Holmes D&D, again, changing Village Priest to Priest. We talked about that already. Okay, now AD&D is going to keep the Acolyte, Adept, Priest, and then it's going to start switching things around. So you're going to have Curate at level 4 instead of Vicar. And then some early versions of the Player's Handbook for AD&D did not have a level title for a 5th level cleric, which is blank. Later editions replaced that with the term Perfect. Now, a lot of people have gone back and forth and said that was a typo and it should have said prefect. Other people said, no, there is a perfect that is in some cultures that they use that as a term. So it could be either one, whether that is a mistake or not. I've been told, in certain publications, that every once in a while you'll see somebody refer to a 5th level cleric as a prefect. And so, people use that as proof that oh no, it was a typo, but who knows? It says perfect in other editions. Okay, and then you have Canon, Lama, Patriarch, High Priest, and then high priest 10th level, etc. So in OD&D, there was no high priests for regular clerics. However, we're going to talk about in a second some different types of level titles. All right, and then in the BX edition, you keep acolyte, adept, and priest as your first three, but it adds priestess in parentheses. And then it goes back to having vicar at level 4 instead of curate like AD&D has, and then it has curate at level 5, and then elder, which is a new title, not used in any previous edition, and then bishop, lama, and then matriarch / patriarch. And then there is no high priest in BX D&D. Okay, and then let's look here at thief, and you have for original D&D apprentice, footpad, burglar. Robber, burglar, cutpurse, sharper, pilfer. We talked about those before. Now, Holmes D&D is going to repeat those first three again: apprentice, footpad, and robber. And Moldvay D&D is going to do the same thing: apprentice, footpad, and robber, and burglar, cutpurse. It's very, very close to the original titles. It is going to not have a master pilfer, and the reason it's not going to have that is because they want the level title of thief to be your 9th level. That's your name level, and then it's going to go to master thief, and then at 9th level. I'm sorry, so that thief is going to be at 8th level, and then master thief is going to be at 9th level, and then 10th level master thief, etc. Now AD&D is going to change this a little bit, and they're going to say that a first level thief is called a rogue, but then in parentheses it says apprentice. I always thought apprentice was a better name for a magic user, or like somebody who studies. I mean, I guess you could study to be a thief, but rogue to me seems better. It's going to use footpad and cutpurse, robber, burglar. It uses a lot of the same terms, but it changes the level. And then Gary's going to introduce some things like filcher and magsman, which is a very archaic term that kind of like fell out of use. And like I looked it up, and I want to say it was like in the early 1500s when people stopped using that term, but Gary wanted to use that, so he threw that in there. And that's an interesting thing. Some of these terms that Gary uses, again, are these like archaic words that hadn't been in use forever. And the fact that he was able to find these words and then use them for these level titles without access to the internet, I think is fascinating. So he obviously had a very big library and must have had some very, very old or very extensive dictionaries and thesauruses to find these different words. Okay, but let's look at monk really quick. And now we're going to only be comparing from this point on. We're only going to be comparing original D&D to AD&D, because the rest of these classes, monk, assassin, druid, rangers, illusionists, bards, paladins, barbarians, thief, acrobats, and cavaliers don't exist in other editions of D&D. Now, some of them do creep into the Beckme edition at higher levels, but there were no level titles listed in the companion and the master's sets for what the level titles would be for those, like, say, paladins or druids or whatnot. So we're going to ignore that edition and just look at original D&D versus AD&D. And for monks, we see it's pretty close between original and AD&D. However, original AD&D is going to introduce brother at level 3 instead of disciple. So they're going to bump it down. And disciple is going to be level 4 instead of level 3. It's going to use immaculate, master. Now, original D&D used grandmaster, and Gary changes that in AD&D to senior master, or superior master, which I kind of felt was a miss. I think grandmaster made more sense, but and then he's, instead of doing like Grandmaster of Dragons, he's just going to call it Master of Dragons or Master of the North Wind, that kind of thing. And that's going to go all the way through up to level 17 in AD&D at Grandmaster of Flowers. And that is the highest level in any of the editions where the titles are unique every single level, all the way through from 1 through 17. Most classes top out usually at level 9 or 10, where you top out with a unique title, maybe 11, but a monk goes all the way up through level 17. Druids and assassins are also going to be higher, but monk is the highest. Now, some of these terms for monk, the theory is that, and if you watch my video in the monk class, I talk about this, but a lot of these level title names were thought to be inspired by names of like mahjong tiles. Okay, so now you have assassin, and in OD&D you have apprentice. So again, we talked about that's repeating a level title for a first level thief in original D&D is apprentice, which I don't like. I don't like repeating things because I think it causes confusion, especially if you know why we were using these level titles to begin with. So AD&D is going to change that to bravo, and then it's going to put apprentice in parentheses. which I think is a better choice. So OD&D's got killer, murderer, slayer, cutthroat, dacoit, thug. We talked about that. Now, Gary's going to remove dacoit, which was an obscure term, but then he's going to introduce two even more obscure terms, rudderkin and waghalter. So rudderkin is again, a very antiquated term. Some people say it's a little bit derogatory, but it essentially means like you're like a beguiler or a crafty fox is a rudderkin, and then a waghalter is somebody who is going to be hanging from the gallows. So again, both antiquated terms by the time Gary's doing this, and even to find those terms, would have been a chore, I think, again, without access to the internet. So then he's got murder, thug, killer, cutthroat. So he's going to use the assassin, expert, senior, chief, prime, assassin, and then guildmaster of assassins. And then he's going to add an extra level on top of that, which is the grandfather of assassins. So kind of fitting in with that kind of Godfather theme. He said grandfather, but I think it kind of works. Okay, so druid, you have aspirant and then those initiates. So Gary's going to add in a new level at level 2, which is the Oviate. And then he's going to have the initiates of 1st through 9th circle. And then he's got the druid, archdruid, and the great druid. Now, in the 1985 Unearthed Arcana, druids are going to get extra levels beyond that. There's a grand druid, and then there's like Hierophant druids that get added onto that, but we're not going to talk about that right now. Okay, so then you have Rangers, and this is a class designed by Joe Fisher that debuted in Strategic Review number 2 from spring of 1975. And Gary pretty much follows the titles that Joe used, especially the first 3 levels: Runner, Strider, and Scout. Now, Joe used Guide for level 4, and Gary's going to replace that with Courser. And then he's going to add in Tracker, and then he's going to move Guide after that, and then he's going to add in Pathfinder, which Joe had, and then he's going to skip over Warder and Guardian, and then he's going to add in a level title of Ranger, and then Ranger Knight and Ranger Lord. So it's close, but not exact. Okay, so Illusionist, same thing. Debuted in Strategic Review issue number 4. And this is by another person, and I just forgot their name, but I talk about them in my video on the Illusionist class. But they had like minor trickster, master trickster. So Gary's going to add prestidigitator in. And again, he's repeating the level title for a first level magic user, which is not something I really like. And then he's going to add in the minor trickster, master trickster, Kabbalist, visionist, phantasmist, apparitionist, spellbinder, illusionist, and then illusionist 11th level, etc. So it's pretty close. He just adds in that extra prestidigitator. Now, the Bard debuts in Strategic Review. It's volume 2, number 1, which is, I think, actually issue number 5. And this is from February of 1976 by Doug Schwegman. And this is in the original class, and original D&D was a standard core class. It was just a regular class, and it had level titles. And Gary's going to completely change how the class works in the appendix of the player's handbook that we talked about, but he's going to pretty much use the level titles that were used before. The one that he's going to change is, instead of having a lore master, he's going to call it a lorist, which is kind of a goofy word. Another weird word on here is Rackerade, which is the level, what is that, 5? Yeah. So I looked that up because I didn't know what that was. It turns out that even Gary doesn't remember where that word came from. Somebody asked him in, when Gary was answering questions on, I think it was Dragon's Foot. People would go in the forums and ask him questions. And someone said, like, where did you find this word? Because I can't find it. And then he said, like, I don't really remember, but I think it means this. And like, I don't even remember what he said, but like, he couldn't remember what it meant. My understanding is that it was listed in some obscure text about ancient Irish poets and things like this. And, but like, if you like try to look up this term online, pretty much the only thing you're going to find about it is that it's used in Dungeons and Dragons. So again, Gary had access to some interesting books to find this. All right. So now we're going to have the Paladin, level titles here from Advanced D&D, and there's no comparison here because we don't have anything to compare it to. So the one thing I wanted to point out is the level title of Chevalier, which is also used as a level title for the Cavalier class, but it's a completely different level. So we've talked about Barbarians before. We've talked about Cavaliers and Thief Acrobats. So those are our character class descriptions. Now, what's interesting is I have heard people say for the fighter class specifically that if you look at the terms that Gary used and you look in a thesaurus, that pretty much the titles that Gary used in order were exactly from the thesaurus back in the day. Well, the thing is, there's a bunch of different printings of thesauruses, and so I don't really know how that makes sense. But this is the one that I used back in junior high, high school, and college. You can see it's pretty beat up because I used it a lot, not only for school but for Dungeons and Dragons, like world building and things like that. But I looked up fighter in here just to give us a sense of what we're going to find. So if you look up the term fighter, first off, you see in giant all caps, it says combatant, which means we're going to look there first because it's going to have more terms that we can use. So if you look up combatant, so you see disputant, litigant, belligerent, none of those are used. But you do see fighter, swashbuckler, sure, fighting man, pugilist, boxer, bruiser, gladiator, wrestler, swordsman is used. And then you see warrior, soldier, man-at-arms, campaigner, veteran. So veterans used. So I don't know that this theory that Gary just grabbed the thesaurus and used the terms in order as they were listed and used those as the level titles, I don't really think that makes sense. But I do think, obviously, that he did use a thesaurus. And it's interesting. So Tim Kask, who worked with Gary, he was and again, Tim was the first employee hired by TSR. So not a founder, but the first actual employee on the payroll. Tim, in his Curmudgeon in the Dungeon YouTube channel, at one point talks about the idea that like he really didn't like level titles. He found them that they were like more trouble than they were worth because they couldn't find enough synonyms to use for all these different terms. So going through the thesaurus didn't always work because they couldn't find enough terms to describe these different things and make them unique. And so he thought it was more trouble than it was worth. And that makes me wonder if that's why we saw in Unearthed Arcana that the barbarian, the level title was just straight down the line barbarian, because they'd already used every other term that they could have used for that somewhere else. And they couldn't come up with 9 or 10 unique terms that meant barbarian. Who knows? So that's our look at which editions used level titles and what those titles were, how they compare, and the different names and things like that used. And so then next up, I'm going to talk about where these titles come from and why they were put into the game. Okay, so now let's talk a little bit about where these level titles come from. Like, where did the concept come from and why did Gary Gygax include them in original D&D? So, of course, original D&D is written by Gygax and Arneson. It's created by Gygax and Arneson, right? But we've talked before, Gary's going to do the majority of like the typing and the writing. Like he's taking Dave Arneson's stuff that he had done, and then Gary's going to kind of change it and make it kind of his own thing. So it's credited to both of them. They're both extremely important, both necessary to create this game. But as far as the writing style, that's coming from Gary. So again, to my knowledge, from talking from folks who played in Dave Arneson's Blackmoor game, which is the predecessor game, the progenitor to Dungeons and Dragons. It's one of the things, but it's the biggest influence on the creation of Dungeons and Dragons. So my understanding is that there were no such thing as level titles in the Blackmoor game. The levels, even that idea is very loose. It's a very different concept than what we're going to see codified in Dungeons and Dragons. So in the Blackmoor game, similarly to the Braunstein game that came before Blackmoor, characters are playing a role, right? Or an archetype, whatever you want to call it. But there wasn't this idea, at least again, as I understand from talking to those folks, of like level titles. So most people would say that level titles are going to come from this book. This is Chainmail. This is a later printing. This is a TSR version of Chainmail. Originally was published by Guidon Games in 1971. And you have the fantasy supplement here in the back, which again, most people are going to say was based on the work done by Leonard Patt earlier for the Middle-earth game. So in here, you have the fantasy supplement again, and you have this description of all these different types of characters, but they're not characters necessarily. They're troops, they're figures. It's the figure that you were going to use. And the idea here is that rather than like a typical war gamer, your figure is going to represent 10 or 20 or 50 or however many troops, because you couldn't have all those troops out on your table. One, it would be unwieldy. Two, it would be too expensive. And then three, where would you store them in between? But in here, we have this idea of the heroes and anti-heroes. And it says, included in this class are certain well-known knights, leaders of army contingents, and similar men. They have the fighting ability of 4 figures. So those are heroes, the class being dependent on the arms and equipment of the hero types themselves, who can range from light foot to heavy horse. So that's another thing in Chainmail, this idea that like you've got infantry and cavalry, and you've got archers, and you have, halberdiers, and all these different kinds of things that all have different armor, they have different weapons, and they can do different things in combat. That is essentially a way of distinguishing these different troop types. Well, here we have the hero that's saying that they're the equivalent of 4 figures. And then you have the superhero. Few and far between, these fellows are one-man armies, particularly when armed with magical weaponry. They act as hero types in all cases, except they're about twice as powerful. So again, I have talked about this before, but let's go back to our level titles here, all the way back to Meta Magic 1974, and check out the level titles for Fighting Man. And we see that at level 4, hero, and level 8 is superhero. So again, if a hero is the equivalent of 4 figures, that's kind of like 4th level. And then if a superhero is twice as powerful as a hero, that means they're essentially 8th level. Okay, so we have that. Then you have down here wizards. And then it says including sorcerers at -1, warlocks at -2, magicians at -3, and seers at -4. Well, if you look backwards on the magic user line, you have wizards, sorcerers, warlocks, magicians, and seers. So it's skipping a few in between, but seer being the least powerful of your wizards from Chainmail, and then going forward. Right? So this idea that you need to have different names for different things depending on how powerful they are. So having a character called a hero that is the equivalent of 4 figures is much easier to just call them a hero, and you know what it is that they do, rather than saying, oh, I have a guy here that's equivalent of 4 figures. And so it just does all these things, the equivalent of what 4 figures can do, right? So, well, you just call him a hero, and then you know what you're talking about. And then with wizards, because you had different power levels of these wizards, calling them a seer or a magician or a warlock or a sorcerer or a wizard, you knew what their power level was, because in Chainmail, there is no concept of calling something a level. So it might be easier nowadays to say, oh, he's an 8th level wizard versus a 2nd level wizard, or whatever that is. They didn't have that terminology back then. So the distinguishing thing was to have a unique name to call them something, so that you could say, oh, a seer, and you knew what a seer could do versus what a warlock could do versus what a wizard could do, based on those unique names. Now, the other thing that's unique in here, if we look at it, are all these different monster types. So if you look at something like goblins and kobolds, and it says, well, goblins and kobolds see well in dimness or dark, and they don't like bright light, blah, blah, blah. They subtract 1 if they're in bright light, and then it tells you their point value. Okay, and then you have something like orcs. Besides reacting to light in the same way of goblins, orcs are nothing more than overgrown goblins. So this is important. You have goblins, you have kobolds, and then you have an orc, and it's essentially telling you that an orc is just an overgrown goblin. So it is a goblin, essentially. It's just bigger and stronger. Okay, and they have a different point value, 2.5 versus 1.5. So you have these monsters in here that are really described as being the same to each other, except that they're bigger and stronger. Okay, so now let's look at our monsters from Monsters and Treasure. This is volume 2 of the 3 booklets for original Dungeons and Dragons. Okay, and we're going to get into this idea of these different monsters. So let's look. Goblins. hit dice, 1 minus 1. Kobolds are half a hit die. Orcs are 1 hit die. Hobgoblins and gnolls. So hobgoblin is a 1 plus 1 hit die, and then a gnoll is 2 hit die. Ogres are 4 plus 1. Okay, so those right in order right there is important again. And now if we look at what they're capable of doing, so it tells you goblins are described in Chainmail. They see well in darkness or dim light. They subtract 1 from their morale die when they're in bright light, etc. Attack dwarves on sight. Okay. Kobolds treat these monsters as if they were goblins, except that they will take from 1 to 3 hits, blah, blah, blah. Okay, but treat them as if they were goblins. Orcs. And that gives you the tribe name of orcs, which I think is awesome. It also specifically tells you that you can base your decision on token or random chance. So they're still digging in. Pardon me for I hit my little thing here that holds my camera, but they're still mentioning Tolkien. They should have removed all references of Tolkien by this particular printing in order to avoid getting into trouble. But they've already told us that in Chainmail that orcs are essentially big, strong goblins, and they're not going to really veer away from that in here. It doesn't come right out and say it, but it doesn't. It tells you to treat goblins as Chainmail, and then we have orcs. Okay. And then you have hobgoblins. These monsters are large and fearless goblins. And then gnolls, you have a cross between gnomes and trolls. And then it says perhaps. Okay. So trolls are able to regenerate. They have a little bit of extra things, but the one thing that they have is more hit dice. Okay. And then you have ogres, large and fearsome monsters. And they don't do anything other than have more hit dice. They're stronger. Okay. So the idea then is that you have this class of monsters that essentially are all kind of the same. Kobolds, goblins, orcs, and hobgoblins. Nowadays, we're going to separate them out, and they're going to be very, very different. Even ogres, I think you could stick in there at the far end of the list, right? As being strong. But they're all part of that classification. Like even in 3rd edition, they had like those were the goblinoid characters. And essentially, each one is just stronger than the last. They have more hit dice. They do more damage. They have better armor or like whatever it is, right? But you go from kobolds at half hit dice to goblins at 1 minus 1 to orcs at 1 to was it hobgoblins at 1 plus 1. Then gnolls are at 2, and then you have ogres at 4. Then in Greyhawk, you're going to have the addition of the bugbear, which is going to fill in at 3. It's 3 plus 1, I believe. Yes, here's bugbear's hit die 3 plus 1. Okay, so that's filling in that missing level between the gnoll at hit die 2 and then the ogre at hit die 4 plus 1. Okay, so and why are they doing that? It's so that you know what level of the dungeon to place them on. Okay, so you're going to put your kobolds, goblins, and probably your orcs on level 1. Hobgoblins are going to straddle between level 1 and then level 2. You're going to put your gnolls on level 2. You're going to put your bugbears on level 3. You're going to put your ogres on level 4. Because remember, the deeper you go into the dungeon, the harder it's supposed to get. Now, it doesn't always equate to that 1 for 1, but the idea is the weaker level monsters are going to be at the lower levels of the dungeon, and the higher hit dice monsters are going to be at the higher levels of the dungeon, which is deeper but higher number level. Okay, so if you think about that, they could have just said, oh, well, this is a 1st level goblin, this is a 2nd level goblin, this is a 3rd level goblin, but they don't do that. They come up with unique names for that. Now, part of that is just because it's fun, it's immersive in world building, and it gets you away from thinking of these things as just a bunch of numbers. And it's fun to create all the different cultures and like draw them and like make them look different and everything. But at the base part of it, when you break it down, really all they are is they're all goblins. They all don't do well in bright light. They excel at being in dim light, and they don't really do anything other than attack. Like they don't have any special abilities or powers, right? So that's kind of my point. So the different names for the monsters, if you think about it, it's really not that unlike the different level titles for the classes. Having a level 1 veteran as a fighter, and a level 2 as being a warrior, and a level 3 as being a sword master. It's essentially like saying you have a kobold, you have a goblin, you have an orc. Okay, the levels don't always match up, but in the order, you get what I'm saying, right? So I think that that's a unique way of looking at this idea of level titles, because again, the terminology that we use these days, it wasn't ubiquitous back then. This was a brand new game, and they didn't realize, they use level in so many different ways. In Holmes Basic, there's a whole section in the book where it describes that you're going to use the term level 4 different ways. You're going to use it to describe your class level, your dungeon level, your spell level, and I forget what the fourth one is off the top of my head. Dungeon class, spell, and something else like so. But it's going to describe. It tells you that you're going to use the term level so many different ways, and that you'll just get used to it. After a while, you'll be able to figure out like which level you're talking about, and. But again, they weren't used to this idea of like saying, oh, it's a first level this, it's a second level this. They were using these specific terms. So to me, level titles for character classes are really not all that far removed from the idea of different monster names for different types of monsters. Now, obviously, there's a ton of different monsters that all have half hit points, or half hit die, or 1 hit die, or 1-1, or whatever it is. I'm just looking at the goblin characters, but I think the concept still stands. This idea of the relationship between a character's level and their level title, a dungeon level, the number of hit dice that you have for each one of those that's equated with you for each one of those, and then your monster name. All of those things, your dungeon level, monster name, hit dice, and level title, they're all related to this idea of having a descriptive name to help you understand this. So if we look at the Underworld and Wilderness Adventures, this is volume 3 of the original set, and you see that the monster level tables, look at the terms that they're using. Dungeon level 2, you might see a conjurer or a warrior. Those are level titles, and they're listed right here alongside the monster names. Okay, and same thing, level 3. You see here misspelled, but you see heroes, swashbucklers, magicians, okay, evil priests, etc. So that's the idea of, for me, I think this idea, and I had never really considered it before. I mean, you see it even repeated here in Greyhawk, where he's going to add in robbers and burglars, and he's adding in footpads because the thief class was introduced, right? So for the levels 1 and 2 here. So it never really occurred to me to think of level titles as sort of being the equivalent of monster names. And I've not seen this suggested anywhere else. I don't really think it's revolutionary necessarily, but it does help, I think, kind of create a situation where we can try to understand why these things were included in the game. Gary was using a distinctive name rather than just saying like a level 1 fighter, level 2 fighter, right? So even the tables we saw in original D&D, they don't even number the levels. The number is not even on the table. It's just the name. And I think it's a similar concept to the idea of like naming the monster and have a distinctive name. So that is just, again, a theory that I kind of came up with as I was researching this. And it's one of the reasons I wanted to make this video, because again, I don't really think I've seen anybody discuss it from that particular standpoint. And I would love to hear your thoughts to see if you have, maybe you have, or you already knew that. And maybe I think I've discovered something here and it's really not all that revolutionary. I just thought it was kind of a unique way of looking at it. So I would love to hear your thoughts on that and let me know, or maybe you think I'm way off base and it has nothing to do with that. But again, because we don't have from Gary in any of his writings for any of the different editions, including the ones that are revised by Holmes and Moldvay, all those things, there's never a discussion of what it is, what the level title is, and what you're supposed to do with it, and how to use it in the game. That's an important thing. It's listed. It doesn't seem to have any mechanical impact on the game. But if you're new to the game and you just see that listed there, I don't know that I would know what I'm supposed to do with that. So as kids, we never used them. I always listed it on my sheet because it said to. If you had the official sheets, there was a space on the sheet that you would fill in your level title. And so I always dutifully filled in my level title because I thought that's what you were supposed to do. But then as far as like in game, it never came up. The Dungeon Master never referred to NPCs we met by their level title, and we never used them. I do think it was a missed opportunity, but because there was really no context for us to use it other than seeing the names listed in the encounter tables, like I was just showing you for Monsters and Treasure and Greyhawk, and that happens all the way through different editions of these ones that use level titles, is referring to the class by their level title by level in the encounter tables. Okay, so other than that, you don't really see it come up as far as what you're supposed to do with it. And again, I do think that was unfortunately a missed opportunity, because I think that there's some world building elements here that could be used. And I'm going to talk about that in a minute, but I do want to just ask if you guys use level titles, or maybe you have a different way of explaining them, or why you think that they were included. I would love to hear it. So there was an article in this issue of Dragon Magazine. This is issue number 72. It's the second issue I ever got, and it's because it had the Cavalier in it. I saw it had an official new class. This is from April of 1983, and it is the Up on the Soapbox column, and this is Level Titles Don't Do Justice. They aren't used much and aren't useful anyway. This is by John T. Sapienza Jr., who's written a few things in Dragon before. And basically the gist of this article is exactly what the title says. He says, the custom of giving each level within every character class its own distinctive name, at least for the first 8 or so levels, dates back to original D&D rules, he says, of 1973. I mean, it was published in 1974, but okay. Says at that time, there are exactly 3 official roles played in the game, and of these, provision was made for clerics up to 8th level, fighters up to 9, and magic users up to level 11. And then it says, it appears the original concept was that characters would use the name levels in gaming as designations of rank or skill instead of using the overall character class name, which makes kind of superficial sort of sense, since it's a matter of pride to have achieved high ranks in any field. And since the character will be spending any number of expeditions in practice at a given level, giving the level a name to go by must have looked useful. And then he goes on to say, the problem is that as a practical matter, the level names are not useful. How many D&D or AD&D players memorize the level names of all the character classes? So that is a problem. I think having to memorize those and then remember what level it is. I also think the repetition that we talked about, having first level thieves and assassins have apprentice as a title, having first level magic users and illusionists have prestidigitator as a title, and then having chevalier as a level title for both paladins and cavaliers, but 2 completely different levels. That breaks the usefulness of these titles of helping describe, what it is that you're looking at, that you're facing when you are repeating the titles. And he says, and he basically just says nobody uses them. That's the gist of this whole article. Nobody uses these, and they're not helpful. And then he says, it's obvious they delve deeply into their thesauruses and producing names for levels. And then he goes on to describe one of the main complaints about the level titles. It's usually directed at the cleric, and it makes sense because the cleric level titles are mixing titles of different types of faiths. So the majority of the level titles are very much, for clerics, are very much based in like Western European Christian traditions, specifically like Catholic Christian traditions. But then you have the title of Lama thrown in there, which of course doesn't fit at all with like patriarchs and that kind of thing. And then you also have like Adept, which is typically associated more with like magic use, I would say, than clericism. And so he goes all into like, you would no more speak of a bishop of a Tibetan monastery than you would speak of a lama of a Catholic diocese. So that is a problem. I think the cleric titles needed a little bit of cleaning up. And I was never excited about those when I was a kid. And then he talks about like, and then the magic user titles. He goes into explaining, the author of this article, basically saying that like, the way that we think about them now, a medium, a seer, a necromancer, a conjurer, a summoner, those are all different kinds of magic, and yet you're giving them as level titles for this magic user, but it doesn't really equate with the spell list and the things that they are given access to, the spell levels. So, and that I can see is a problem. Trying to come up with more generic terms doesn't necessarily make sense, but or it could have made sense, but they didn't. And so they came up with these very specific practices of magic that don't always, like, having a necromancer be an 8th level magic user. If you're not practicing necromancy, then why are you a necromancer? It's just, those are kind of an issue. So basically the article just goes on to complain. It's longer than it needs to be, to essentially say that they don't like them. Okay, but then the editor is going to jump in here. and say right here, editor's note, the suggestions noted, however, in the interest of consistency and uniformity, we'll continue to publish level titles and experience level charts for various NPC classes. We try to present new classes in a form that's as compatible as possible with the official rules. Readers who do use level titles to refer their characters will be able to do so, and if you don't use them, you're not hurt by it because you can just ignore it, is essentially what it says. So, but even back then, so this is, still pretty early in the game. Unfortunately, the covers become detached from my magazine here. But back then, people were still kind of saying, like, what do we use these level titles for? And it's because it's never explained what you're supposed to do with them. So I think that that's interesting that it warranted a whole, the soapbox is like the op-ed piece of Dragon Magazine. But it warranted a whole, 1.5 page article for someone to kind of say, like, what are these for? And then the editor basically said, yeah, we're going to keep using them because it's consistent with the rules, which it was at the time. Now, 6 years later, there's no longer going to be consistent, but at the time it was. So that's interesting, I think. And, there's just various different depictions of level titles. So I meant to mention this before, but if you look back in Men and Magic here, they even have separate titles for anti-clerics, what they call the anti-clerics, which are evil clerics. So evil acolyte, they kind of like just do evil in front of it, except if you like shaman is a level 3 instead of an evil priest. Then evil priest moves to level 4, evil curate, evil bishop, evil lama, and then evil high priest. So evil high priest is going to become so ubiquitous that it becomes abbreviated as EHP. And I've talked about this before. There's several times that gets used where they never actually define it. They just put EHP in all caps and they assume that that they meant evil high priest. So now it's been suggested by some people that the level titles were sort of meant to evoke this idea of like the very structured and rigid medieval society where there were different, levels essentially of your social status. And that by referring to somebody like, whether it's sir or lord or whatever it was, you kind of knew where they ranked in that social hierarchy, and that the class level titles are meant to evoke that. So that is one way that you can use them if you want. So in theory, then what that means then is that you are going to equate class level to social level or social standing, so that a 5th level fighter would be on the same social standing as a 5th level magic user or a 5th level cleric. So, and there is a little bit of that, and again in medieval society where you had certain levels of the church, right, of the Catholic Church specifically in the medieval era, and certain titles within there or certain ranks, and they were equivalent of the same level of like nobility. So like, dukes and barons and that kind of thing. There was an equivalent person within the church that held the same social standing, despite the fact that they like weren't landowners, but they were treated the same, essentially. So there is something to that if you want to get into that kind of like social level thing within your game. That is a way of using the level titles. Okay. So the way that I think is a fun way to look at it, and I did suggest this in my short video that I have, but I do have like a short about level titles. It's like a minute long, but I'm able to go obviously into much more depth here. So one of the ways I think of looking at that, I think is a really fun and unique way of doing it. And it's really inspired by the idea of the druid, the assassin, and the monk classes that have these very hierarchical structures that makes it appear that like there's one unified global entity that names these levels and that you're part of this organization. So you're not just an assassin, but you are part of an organization of assassins. And you move up through that organization until you get to the very top, at which point like you have to fight and kill the person above you in order to keep moving up in level. So it's sort of like, on a Klingon ship in Star Trek where the first officer's part of his duty is to kill the captain and take over the ship. And like everybody kind of knows that like the person beneath you is going to do that. Or like in the Mirror universe, the Starfleet was like that as well, right? Like your subordinates were always out looking for a way to advance by killing the person in charge. So there's something to be said for that, for like assassins and like having these different levels. Monks are the same thing. And I believe monk combat does not have to be lethal. The assassin one, I think, does have to be lethal. And the druids, kind of same thing. There's only a certain number of druids at higher levels. And so in order to advance, you kind of have to like move somebody out of the way, usually through some kind of combat. Well, if you kind of take that approach, and it doesn't have to be the combat area, but if you think about the different level titles as sort of like different ranks, or like maybe we use the word degrees within an organization, then it could be that each one of these classes represents some kind of almost like a fraternal organization, right? And so it's a little tricky with things like clerics, for example, because of all the different faiths that are involved. But even with that, I think it could work if the idea is that you've chosen, your class is not your profession. Your class is like, what your skills are, and it's like a tack on to your profession. So your profession might be that you are a man at arms, or maybe you're a guard at the gate, or maybe you're a guard at the for the Baron, right? You're a personal bodyguard, or maybe you're a town watch person, or like whatever. That's your job. That's your profession. Or again, you could be a professional adventurer, like you go into dungeons and fight things, and that could be a job in a fantasy type world. But you're part of the ancient order of fighting men or fighters, okay? And that bestows upon you these ranks, sort of like, think about it like the Masonic Lodge, right? Like the Blue Lodge, which has like 3 levels. It has, when you start out, you are an entered apprentice. These are all names that were based on the early stonemason guilds. And then you become a journeyman. And then your 3rd degree Master Mason, that is the highest level that you can go within the Blue Lodge specifically. So you get your 3rd degree. Okay. But then from there's all these other things that you can do. So there's levels or degrees 4 through 32nd for York Rite. There's also degrees 4 through 32nd for Scottish Rite. There's the Cryptic Masons. There's the Royal Archmasons. There's other organizations like the Order of Eastern Star or the Ladies of the Nile. There's all these different affiliate organizations that all kind of sprang out of this, like the Blue Lodge, right? Was the original one. And they all have their own degrees and their own secret codes and signals and handshakes and rituals and different officers and all these kinds of things. But the thing is like, you can have people on opposite sides, like during the Revolutionary War, even going all the way back. And there were people that were part of the Masonic Lodge that were fighting against each other. But like when they recognized each other, sometimes they were able to have conversations and stuff, but they were on opposite sides of the conflict. And so that's still possible. It's possible to be part of this like sort of fraternal organization that's bestowing upon you these ranks as you move up through it, and you learn the new secrets of that degree. So you start out as a veteran, and then you move to become a warrior. And doing that means that like you now have the secrets of the 2nd degree of the international, ancient and accepted order of fighters, like I said. And you could do that for each thing. And I think that's a fun way to incorporate level titles into the game and have them kind of mean something. And in that way, you would use them. You would address a person by their title. And, and you can have different, roles within those organizations as well, like different, like I was part of a youth group called the Order of Demolay, and it had only 2 degrees. It had the initiatory degree and the Demolay degree, but you had officers within that, and your lowest level officers were called the preceptors, and there were 7 of those. But you had an almoner, and you had a scribe, and you had a sentinel, and you had a junior deacon and a senior deacon, and you had a junior sentinel or a junior steward and a senior steward. You had a chaplain and a marshal, and you had your junior counselor, senior counselor, master counselor. Like, so you had all those different like positions within the organization, but you also had your different degrees. So it kind of helps you to like flesh this idea out of how to use these level titles. So, and I really like the idea of like learning new secrets as you move up, and unlocking like different secret codes and handshakes and signals and words or whatever it is to identify other people within that, have also those same, knowledge, that same knowledge and those same degrees bestowed upon them. Now, another thing that you can do is just to kind of make it a little bit more fun is do things like have, different level titles for different alignments. So I first came across this idea from Dungeon Crawl Classics, and they did they have level titles. It only goes through 5th level. At least I have the beta version for fighters, clerics, magic users, and thieves. But they break it into different titles for law, neutrality, and chaos. So for fighters, the level titles for law are squire, champion, knight, cavalier, and paladin. But for chaos, it's bandit, brigand, marauder, ravager, and reaver. And then for neutrality, it's wildling, barbarian, berserker, headman or headwoman, or chieftain. And then similarly with magic user, law is evoker, controller, conjurer, summoner, elementalist. But chaos is cultist, shaman, diabolist, warlock or witch, or necromancer. And then neutrality is astrologist, enchanter, magician, thaumaturgist, and sorcerer. And you can see the other titles here for the other classes. And but I also think it's cool because they did it for the non-human classes as well. So dwarves, lawful dwarves are agents, brokers, delegates, envoys, and syndics. But for chaos, they're rebels, dissidents, exiles, iconoclads, and renegades. And then for neutrality, they're apprentices, novices, journeyers, crafters, and thanes. And then elves and halflings only have one title, regardless of alignment. I don't like that both of them share wander as the first level title, but then elves are seers, questers, savants, and elders. And halflings are explorers, collectors, accumulators, and wise ones. So I think that's a fun way of doing it. I know Shadow Dark does that as well. They have level titles for the fighter, magic user, cleric, and thief that are alignment dependent, and a lot of them are very, very similar to the ones that we just saw for Dungeon Crawl Classics. But I love that Shadow Dark was trying to keep that alive, considering that it's really sort of more of a riff on 5th edition and just playing 5th edition in more of an old school style, but stripping out a lot of stuff. And I thought it was cool that the creator Kelsey Dion included the level titles. So that's another thing that you can do. And then I think if you do that and you have those different level titles for different alignments, that also helps explain if you incorporate my idea of treating the different level titles as like different degrees within an organization or a fraternal order. That also helps explain the idea of alignment languages, right? That's why somebody who speaks chaotic would have a different language than someone who speaks lawful. It's because they're being taught this language by belonging to this order that is bestowing these different degrees upon them in their rituals. So I thought that was a fun way to look at alignment languages as well. And those are just a few ideas of how you can use these. I've used a little bit of them in the game I run for my daughter. I haven't dived into it too much, but I'm starting to do it a little bit more. As an example, there is a witch character, and she's known as the witch. And because that's the level that she's at, that's her level title. The players don't know that. They haven't really delved that deep into it, but that's how she's referred to. And it's because that's her title. And so I'm trying to do that a little bit more because I'd like to get some use out of these level titles. When I wrote my book, my supplement for Old School Essentials, so Alchemy, Explosives, and Inventions, which, by the way, you can get this at Drive-Thru RPG right now and print on demand or as a PDF. And but I did include level titles as an option for the different character classes. So for alchemists, I had novices, apprentices, researchers, graduates, mixers, distillers, junior alchemists, alchemist, and master alchemist. So I did kind of break my rule because I used apprentice, which had been used elsewhere, as well as novice. But I was kind of running out of words, which is, like Tim Cass said, it's hard to come up with terms. Demolitionist was fun. Specialist, black powder smith, McTross. Combat engineer, master of explosives, sapper, bombardier, demolitionist, and master demolitionist. And then for inventor, I used tinker, crafter, innovator, builder, artificer, designer, creator, inventor, and master inventor. So I was trying to keep that tradition alive in my thing. Old School Essentials doesn't really use level titles. They are optional. I know Gavin Norman, the creator, is not a big fan, but he did list the original ones. And so I wanted to keep that alive in my book. So those are just some ways that you can look at using level titles, again, to try to have them have a little bit of meaning in your game and use them for world building. So I think that's probably the best way to use those level titles is for world building. Have some organizations, have people refer to each other by those titles. And, when you're DMing, have the NPC refer to people based on their dress or based on the way that they act or whatever it is, have symbols or something and address each other, not as, just by their name, but like also by their title and their level title specifically. And that will help to kind of make your world a little bit more immersive. Okay, so but that's my ideas of how to use those, and I would love to hear your ideas. So please share those in the comments below, and let me know what you thought of this video if you thought it was interesting. So I was really excited. I've been working on this one for almost a week now, and I was excited to put it together, and I hope that you enjoyed it. So let me know in the comments below. And then while you're down there, you will find places where you can find me on social media. You will find links to my blog, and you'll find places where you can support the channel. So the 3 best ways of doing that right now, one I just talked about, which is ordering my book, Alchemy, Explosives, and Inventions from Drive-Thru RPG. And there are links down there. There's 2 different backgrounds. There's a plain white background or a parchment color background, but 3 new character classes. And there's all these different character concepts in here. There's art by 2 different people, including Dennis McCarthy. He's a fan favorite of the old school community. But there's new equipment. There's ways to run campaigns. There's a guild hall, a 3-story guild hall with maps, and a bunch of other random tables. So you can find that at Drive-Thru RPG. You can also order something from my shop, like a t-shirt, hoodie, mug, poster, notebook, or other item with exclusive designs that you'll only find at my shop. And then I'll put links to that in the show notes below. And then lastly, you can become a super fan. So you can look for that little heart icon with the $sign in it when you're watching the video. And you can join this other list of fine folks who contribute when I make videos, basically just to say thanks for putting the time and the effort in. And that does things like help me buy the new microphone that I'm using, as well as my new setup that I'm using to basically hold my camera to get these overhead shots. I think I mentioned before, but if you're new to the channel, the way I used to do it was I had 2 giant Lego boxes with yardsticks stretched across the top, and I filmed. And, you know, it worked fine, but it wasn't ideal. And this system that I'm using now is much better. It allows me to move the camera around and get closer shots. And the microphone obviously makes everything better as well. So all of that comes from the Superfan stuff. So that's going to wrap up this particular video again, and I would like to thank you so very much for watching. Stay safe, happy gaming, and I will talk to you next time. Okay, now it's time for the bonus content, what I was drinking and what I was listening to when I made my notes for this video. And it is super dark outside right now, so I am using natural light. You guys, I think by now know, I'm into the Pasadena area of Southern California, and it's the middle of the day. It's like 4 p.m. on Monday the 5th, and it has been dark and gray all day. And so I was going to use the light on my thing here that my camera is connected to, but the problem is when I do that, because this record is in I mean, you can see my window and the reflection right here. There's this just giant ring right here that appears, and like it makes it very hard to see. So I turned the light off. Hopefully it's not too dark for you guys. But anyway, let's talk about what I'm doing here. So my drink is this is called the Oaxacan Old Fashioned. And this was created by a gentleman, a bartender by the name Phil Ward. And originally he was at a bar in New York called Death and Company. And then later on, which is a very famous bar. I've been to Death and Company before when I used to go to New York for business. And then he opened another bar kind of like down the street called Maya Well. And that bar kind of like specialized in mezcal and like tequila but mostly mezcal. And it was a very well-known place for those types of spirits. Unfortunately, that one's closed. Death and Company is still open. But this is a drink created, I think, 2007. And it essentially is one of the first drinks to sort of start putting mezcal on the map for people to experience what it was like. So the mezcal Old Fashioned here has, actually, it's a full pour, a full measure of reposado tequila. And then it has just a half ounce of mezcal, and then a bar spoon of agave syrup. I use slightly less than a bar spoon because I don't like sweet drinks. And then Angostura bitters is what I used. Although I think you could also use like if you wanted to, you could play around with the bitters and use like a mole bitters. I think would go really well with this. But in any case, I used Angostura. And then a flaming orange peel on top. All that means is that you take the orange peel, you light a match, or you have like one of those lighter sticks or whatever. And then when you express the oils from the orange across the match, it kind of like sparks, and it creates a little bit of like a caramely, smoky flavor on the top of the drink. So that's all you have to do. It's not hard unless you can't get the oil to express from your fruit. So sometimes, your orange or your lemon, whatever it is, your citrus is like too dry, it's too old, like whatever it is. And every once in a while, the oils don't want to come out. But in my case, it worked. And then served on a large rock. I unfortunately don't have clear ice. I have cloudy ice, but it is large rock. So cheers. Mhm. So it's a great way to kind of experience, if you're not used to mezcal, kind of experience the flavors. Mezcal can be smoky. Most Americans think that all mezcal is smoky. It doesn't have to be. It can actually be quite fruity. Um, so it's very closely related to tequila. So my friend always says all tequilas are mezcal, but not all mezcal is tequila. I think that's a little too simplistic, but it's kind of in that realm. And now I love that they called it a Oaxacan old fashioned. Oaxaca is the region of Mexico where most mezcal is distilled, I guess, from what I understand, or it's like most famous for that. But I like that they called it an old fashioned because it helps remind people that an old fashioned cocktail does not have to be made with bourbon or with whiskey. It can be made with any spirit, which, as you've heard me talk about here before, all it means is you have spirit, sugar, water, bitters. And in this case, the water's coming from the ice, but also you have an agave syrup, which is part agave nectar mixed with water to create a syrup, right? And then you've got your bitters and your base spirit, which in this case, the base spirit is split between tequila and mezcal, but still it's the same proportions. Cheers, salud. I mentioned it was Monday, May 5th, and I was looking for something different other than a margarita. I love a good margarita, but I feel like it's just become so cliche to have that on Cinco de Mayo, and I like to do other things. So the one drink I was also thinking about making was it's called the Naked and Famous, and it uses the proportions of the classic Last Word cocktail, which is an equal parts cocktail of spirit, citrus, usually some kind of herbal agent, and then some kind of bitter agent. And in the case of the Naked and Famous, I'm going off the top of my head, I believe it's equal parts of mezcal, lime juice, yellow chartreuse, and Aperol, perhaps. And I had all that except for limes. I didn't have limes in the house. That's another reason I didn't make a margarita, is because I'm lazy. I don't want to go to the store. Okay, so that's it. Now let's look at the album I'm listening to. This is such a fun one. This is Pucho and his Latin soul brothers, Super Freak. So Pucho's real name is actually Henry Brown. He's from New York, but he got exposed to Tito Puente and just other kinds of music, and he really got into like the Latin sound. And like in the 50s, like mid to late 50s, and it really kind of captured his imagination. And so he started playing in that kind of style, and he was in a band. And when that band kind of disbanded, he became a band leader, and he took a lot of people from that band and kind of created his own group that was eventually called the Latin Soul Brothers. And so the earlier albums in their catalog are very much in that realm of kind of like Latin jazz, which is great. It's a lot of fun. But this one, 1972, is a transitional period. It's a transitional album where he's really, really leaning into like jazz funk and jazz fusion. And so the title of the album gives you a little bit kind of, I think, of a hint. It's called Super Freak. So side one is essentially a medley of all these songs from the Curtis Mayfield film. So you've got Superfly, Pusherman, and Freddy's Dead all played in this medley. It takes up nearly the entire first side of the album, and it's just so much fun. Okay, and then there's some other songs on here, including some vocals that are being sung by Marilyn Johnson, which is really, really fun. And but for the most part, it's just kind of like funky jazz, funk, soul, whatever you want to call it. It makes you happy. It's just a fun thing to listen to. It's different than some of the stuff that you would have been listening to if you're trying to delve into some jazz right now. And it definitely gets out of that realm of classic jazz and gets into that kind of like I said, 70s, soul funk era, but still with that jazz backbone. These guys, the players, all have really, really strong jazz chops. They've been playing at this point, most of them for over a decade or more. And so then getting into this era, they're kind of having to shift their sound and kind of like, I don't say they were trying to keep up with the times. I think they were just trying to like celebrate and be part of what was going on at the time and make the music their own. And so I highly recommend checking this out. You can find it on streaming services. Or if you can find the actual album. So it originally came out in 1972. This is a 2022 repressing that was part of Record Store Day that I picked up back then. And actually, I picked it up on recommendation of my friend. So he lives on the East Coast. And so at that point, this is before my friend opened his shop. He had already gone to his shop, picked this up, went home, played it. And then I was waiting in line and he texted me and he's like, you've got to pick this up. You're going to love it. And it wasn't on my list, but I added it and I'm so glad that I did. So definitely check out Pucho and his Latin Soul Brothers Super Freak. And let me know if you try Oaxacan Old Fashioned. Super easy to make. And I think you'll enjoy it. And again, thank you so very much for watching. And I will talk to you next time. Salud.